They warned him not to lift the blanket. They said whatever was under it had made grown warriors turn and walk away without a word. Some said she was cursed. Some said worse. He had already said "I do" before he ever saw her face, and by the time the blanket hit the dirt, it was too late to take it back. Arizona Territory, 1882. What he found underneath would either save his life or end it. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, and Ethan Miller had made a small one, cutting through Apache land to save 3 days on a water run for 20 thirsty head of cattle. He was 25, quiet in the way men get when they've buried something they don't talk about, and riding a steady old horse named Luther who'd never once lied to him about danger. So when Luther's ears went stiff in the middle of a red-walled canyon, Ethan listened. Under the wind, under a hawk's far-off cry, he heard something that didn't belong out here. A child crying. He was off his horse before he'd finished deciding to be. 40 feet into the wash, pressed against a boulder like she was trying to disappear into the stone, was a girl of maybe 8, lips cracked white, eyes barely tracking. Another hour in that heat and she wouldn't have made it. He didn't stop to think about whose child she was or what tribe she belonged to. He gave her water. He cooled her forehead with a strip torn from his own bandana. And that was when the sky turned wrong. A 300-foot wall of dust rolling in from the west faster than anything he'd ever outrun. He got them both under a shallow rock overhang and held on while the storm screamed past for the better part of an hour, the girl's fists knotted in his shirt the whole time. When it passed, she looked up at him with eyes gone suddenly clear, said something in Apache he couldn't understand, and he nodded like he did. "Let's get you home." The camp exploded into motion the second he rode in with her. Women lifted the girl from his arms before Luther had fully stopped. Warriors stood very still and said nothing. And then the man who ran that stillness walked toward him. Not tall, but the kind of presence that made a crowd part without asking. Chaska, the girl's grandfather, the chief. Inside his tent, over coffee stronger than anything Ethan had ever swallowed, Chaska told him plainly. A debt like this couldn't be waived off. Tradition demanded it be paid, and paid in full. He had a daughter, 20 summers old, strong, sharp, and not one warrior in the tribe would take her as a wife. Ethan's stomach dropped. He ran through every explanation his mind could reach for. Sickness, deformity, some flaw hidden just out of sight, because nothing else made sense. A whole tribe doesn't turn its back on a woman for no reason at all. "You may refuse," Chaska told him, "but if you refuse, you leave these lands and do not come back. Yes or no. Now." He thought about the ranch, the cattle, the long, dangerous road home if he said no. He thought about a little girl gripping his shirt like he was the only solid thing left standing. He said yes before he let himself think too hard about why. They brought her out the next morning, wrapped head to foot in a blanket bright as a held breath. Ethan braced for the worst, a scar, a wound, some visible reason an entire people had rejected her. The blanket fell. And the woman standing there was the most beautiful he had ever seen in his life. Hair black as a moonless sky, eyes the color of dark amber, and they weren't looking at him the way a bride looks at a groom. They were looking at him the way you look at a problem you're already halfway to solving, measuring, unimpressed. Nothing wrong with her at all, and that was somehow the strangest part of the whole morning. "Nahimana," Chaska said, "this is your husband now." She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away and didn't look back. Not during the wrist binding, not during the words he couldn't understand. Not once on the 2-hour ride to his ranch. Silent and straight-backed in the saddle the entire way, reading the dust of the trail like a page of scripture, and once, without a word of warning, steering them clean around an ambush that would have killed them both. She said almost nothing for the first 2 weeks. She also, in that time, grew a garden out of dead red stone that had never once produced anything green. She healed a horse Ethan hadn't been able to touch in 2 years. She rebuilt his stable roof from the inside, overnight, without a ladder, and left new beams standing exactly where the old ones had failed a test only she'd seen coming. He started to understand that the question eating at him, "What's wrong with her?" was the wrong question entirely. He just didn't know yet what the right one was. Then, on the 11th night, 3 men broke into the house. They wanted cash, horses, food, and when they found a woman's things in the bedroom, they wanted her. Ethan stood between them and that door with nothing but his bare hands and a promise he intended to keep. And then something dropped from the ceiling beams. Not fell. Dropped. Landing between him and the men with a grace that belonged to something built for exactly this. Nahimana had been up there the whole night. A rope went out flat and caught an ankle. A man hit the floor like a felled tree. A knife came at her and she stepped into it, using the man's own weight to put him through the kitchen table. The third ran before she said a word. In the wreckage, going through a dropped coin purse, Ethan's hand closed on an old, worn coin from a county in Oklahoma that hadn't circulated currency like that in 8 years. His own county, his brother's county. A name he hadn't let himself say out loud since the letter came rose up in his throat. Wade Calloway. That night, over cold coffee neither of them finished, Nahimana finally told him why an entire tribe had let her go. She could outride, outtrack, and outfight nearly every man who'd ever come asking for her hand, and no warrior wanted a wife who made him feel small in front of his own people. So one by one, they'd found other reasons. Too tall, too quiet. Something's not right about her. The real reason was always the same underneath. So I stopped competing, she said. I made myself smaller. Silent felt safe. Ethan told her plainly that every man who'd walked away from her had been a fool. He said it again to make sure it landed. Something in her face cracked open, just slightly, for the first time since the blanket had fallen. 3 days later, Wade Calloway rode up to the gate himself, good coat, good horses, and an offer for the ranch dressed up as generosity. He knew exactly what sat underneath Ethan's land: water. The same water Calloway had killed a man in Oklahoma to take once before. When Ethan refused him, Calloway let the refusal sit in the air like a loaded gun and rode off without raising his voice once, which was somehow worse than if he had. Nahimana didn't wait for the threat to become real. She sent word south, and 2 mornings later a dozen riders came down off the western ridge. Her father, her brother, and a very old man named Makia, who watched her work a wound on a warrior's arm and murmured 2 words that stopped her hands cold. Ayana's hands, her mother's name. A healer whose knowledge had been called dangerous, whose name had been forbidden by a council her own father hadn't had the power to overrule. Nahimana had grown up carrying her mother's gift and her mother's silence in the same breath. That night, by a small fire, she said the name out loud for the first time in her life. Ayana, and let the desert hold it without flinching. Ethan sat beside her and said nothing, because some silences are worth protecting. Calloway tried once more before he left the territory for good, fouling a stretch of the water channel in the dark hours before dawn, a parting insult rather than a real threat. Ethan and Nahimana fixed it together, side by side, hands identically caked in red mud, and it was there, exhausted, filthy, with the sun just cracking the eastern ridge, that he told her he loved her. No ceremony. Just the truest thing he had to say. That is the first time anyone has ever said that to me, she told him. That's a wrong that needed fixing, he said. Chaska gave his blessing that same morning, quietly, the way men who've made mistakes try to make amends without saying so directly. Old Makia said her mother's name once more, out loud, in front of everyone, and this time her father said it too. Ayana would be proud of you. Calloway moved his operations east that spring, chased out by a debt he couldn't outmaneuver and a partnership he hadn't accounted for. The garden kept growing long after that. People started riding considerable distances just to ask the quiet Apache healer at the Miller Ranch about a cough, a fever, a horse gone lame. She always answered in exactly as many words as the question needed, and not one more. Years later, when people in town asked Ethan how the two of them had ended up together, he'd think about it honestly for a moment before answering. "She saved my life," he'd say, more than once, in more than one way. Then he'd go back to whatever she'd already started without him. Because the question he'd carried across that whole desert, "What's wrong with her?" had never once had an answer. Because there was nothing wrong with her at all. What had been wrong was everywhere else, in the men who walked away, in a silence forced onto a healer's name, in a world too slow to make room for what she really was. That world never changed in any large or sudden way. But on one small ranch at the edge of the desert, it changed enough.